Sefer Shmos begins with what's called in the Svarim Yerida Achi Yerida. The descent that follows the descent. The Jewish people coming to Egypt was a descent. The death of their patriarchs, that means Yaakov Avinu and his children, is a second Yerida. Then begins the Golus in earnest, slavery. It begins with Melach Chodesh Asher Lo Yada, a king who acted like he didn't know, or in fact didn't know because he acted new or he was new. And then there was Havan Ischak Mulei Vayamaru Es Chayim. They deceived, they tricked the Jewish people into becoming subordinate and then eventually becoming slaves, and made their lives bitter. So we learned the Vayamaru Es Chayim class, which I think was Chelek Gimel and Likutei Sichos. The Rabbi explained that Vayamaru Es Chayim can't possibly only mean they physically embittered them. It can't possibly mean that the lives were hard, quote, only begashmias. It has to mean that the lives were also hard, beruchnias. And this is one of the issues. What is the meaning of Vayamaru Es Chayim? What does it mean that they made their lives bitter? Not only begashmias, but they made their lives bitter also beruchnias. And the answer was they made everything opposite, right? They took them out of their ability to have a relationship with Hashem in one way, and they made their lives bitter. Beyond that, there was another thing. In other words, the Jews were enslaved. And the Rebbe has Sichos, by the way, where the Rebbe argues that had the Jewish people dealt with the slavery in Egypt precisely as God wished, Mashiach would have come and they got the Torah. In other words, what was the highest possible way the Jews could have survived that exile? Was to go through the hell of Mitzrayim and remain loyal to God. In other words, if they had continued to believe in one God and to practice the 7 laws of Noach, which they had, the Jewish people didn't have 613 mitzvahs. Only 7. The Ovis kept 613 mitzvahs. The Shvatim probably did not. According to the Ramban, they kept them only in Israel and stopped keeping them when they crossed the border into the diaspora, to Chutz La'aretz. But they didn't have. The Jewish people were considered B'nai Nech. Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov were considered Jewish. Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, and Leah considered Jewish. Reuven, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda are not. They're considered B'nai Nech. How could Jews begot non-Jews and then become Jewish again a few generations later? That's very interesting, but that's the way we understand it from a perspective of halacha. So they keep 7 laws of Noach. And at the center of all of those was the belief in God. What ended up happening, they became completely pagan. Pagan to the extent that you couldn't separate a Jew from an Egyptian. They were as immersed in idol worship as the Egyptians were. And that is the meaning of Vayamaru Es Chayim. They didn't only make their bodies bitter, they made their spirits bitter. So the Rebbe has a number of Sichos where he asserts, had the Jews spent those 85 years, 86 years in hell, and remained spiritually connected to God, when they left Egypt, they would have been so purged, they would have been so perfect, they would have been so holy, that would have been Mashiach. But because when they left Egypt, you could barely separate a Jew from an Egyptian, he gave us the Torah and said, now you have to earn it. We got the Torah prematurely. In other words, ideally, we should not get the Torah until Mashiach comes. But since we came out of Egypt undeserving, and he couldn't keep us there longer because he gave a date to the coming of the Geula, right? It's a Chumash. And he took us out, and we didn't deserve to take us out, so he gave us a Torah in order to earn the Geula. So the Taich Vayamaru Es Chayim is that not only were their lives embittered physically, their lives were embittered spiritually. In the words of the Rambam, the first chapter of the laws of idol worship, that it came to pass, it almost came to pass, that the entire tree that Avraham Avinu had planted was totally uprooted. In other words, if Egypt had lasted a little longer, the entire recollection, entire memory of Avraham Avinu would have been erased from the earth and gone forever. Moshe Rabbeinu came a second before it was too late and redeemed us. That's how the Rambam describes it in the first chapter of the laws of idol worship. But there's something else. What's the something else? Their children. What happened to the Jewish children in Egypt? So of course the Torah tells us that the boys had to be thrown into the river the Nile and the girls were allowed to live. When you look in Rashi, what is Rashi's explanation for the boys had to be thrown into the river the Nile? Because the stargazers told the Pharaoh that the Redeemer of the Jewish people was going to be male and he was going to be born. So Pharaoh said, throw them all into the river, so whoever the Redeemer of the Jewish people is going to be is going to die. Rashi points out that there were actually two stages to this degree. The first stage of this degree was when they saw the imminent birth of the Jewish Redeemer. And the second is when they saw that on that very day the Redeemer would be born. On the day Moshe Rabbeinu was born, the announcement was not to kill all male Jews. It was called to kill any male baby born in Egypt, even if they were Egyptian. Because Pari was thinking, if the Redeemer of the Jewish people is going to be born today, maybe he'll be an Egyptian. So on that day, they not only threw into the river the Nile Jewish boys, they threw into the river the Nile every Egyptian boy.
They told all this by the stars? They knew this by the stars?
Yeah, stargazing is a legitimate thing. It certainly was then. Yeah, it's astrology, it's called. Yeah. And we have an ambivalent relationship with astrology because Tamim Tiya Im Hashem Elokecha. You're supposed to live your life sincerely, not by trying to figure out what's going to happen tomorrow. Especially because they don't always read it correctly. There's mystical cults in this world today that are into this, and they predict some pretty amazing things, you know. So the Rebbe says that in this story of how they treated their children, there is also this duality. They weren't only killing them physically, they were killing them spiritually as well. Like in the Mother of Chayim that we learned before. In addition, don't think that the Gezerah was only against the boys, and the girls were home scot-free. It was Exile against both, but in very different ways. Let's go to the text. And as you know, I really underline. From Pasuk, the Pasuk says, Kol habein hayilad, every boy who was born, haya'eda tashlicho, throw him into the river the Nile. Kol habas techayin, any daughter, any female that's born, techayim. Techayin should mean allow her to live. But techayin does not mean allow her to live. Techayin means give her life. Make sure she lives. Frechtman, the commentaries ask, what is the significance of the Pharaoh saying, kill all the boys and give all the girls life? It's obviously if you're killing all the boys, not killing all the girls. It says, his interest was, as the that the newborn sons were thrown into the river the Nile. Und das, was wird sein mit die Töchter, hat ihm nicht interessiert. And what's going to happen to the daughter simply did not interest him in the first place. But he doesn't simply say, kill the boys. He says, kill the boys and keep the girls alive. The fact that he says all the daughters should live is that not only was killing of the boys a decree that was evil, the keeping the girls alive was also a decree. And the Rebbe immediately explains, he declared there from the second paragraph, page 111. The explanation is, Techayin is der Teich und Diuk not you should let them live, you should give them life. What does this mean? Baal Leben, you should give them life, you should make them live. These Mitzrayim, the same Egyptians. Wenn Parayot angesagt to the Pharaoh instructed, as they sollen reinwerfen jüdische Kinder in Teich, they should throw the Jewish boys into the sea. Thinking that it'll kill their body, God forbid. There was an additional instruction as the she'edis apply to kinder, those children that they don't kill, namely the girls. Don't leave them alone. They remain physically alive in Egypt. The Egyptians should give them what kind of life? That ziehen in derech, to rear in their way, in Lebensweg von Mitzrayim, in the way of life of Egypt, to give death to their souls. So you kill the boys physically. And the girls kill spiritually. How? Educated to be good Egyptians. Educated to be good pagans. Don't let them live. Give them life, but an Egyptian life. So the river the Nile is the idol worship of Egypt. Right? Why is the river the Nile the idol worship of Egypt? Because you can deny God if you have a constant supply of water and mud and fertilization, all the other things, the blessings of the Nile. It was very, very famous. It's still very famous. And it still gives its bounty. If you have a constant source of parnasa that never ever is exhausted, who has to pray? It's good. The boys you kill in those waters. The girls you get to drink those waters. They should drink the phenomena of nature's providing and not need God. So actually you're killing them both. You're killing the boys physically and you're killing the girls spiritually. That's the meaning of the words of Chalabas T'chaim. So if you had to put what I just said in other words, the men and the women, the adults, were made bitter, all of them, physically and spiritually. The children, the boys were made bitter in one way, they were physically killed by being thrown into the river Nile. And the girls were being made bitter in a different way, by being kept alive in the spirit of Egypt. And the Torah tells us both the decrees at the same time. In the Zelva Pasuk, in the very same Pasuk, it tells us that you have to kill the boys and keep the girls alive. Is a raya, it's proof as der v'chola bas techayon, that keeping the daughters alive in the spirit of Egypt is nit kein kleiner gezeira von kolabein hayi'ile da'ela tashluchu, is no less a decree than killing the boys. I'm on page 111, second column, fourth line. To kill one's soul and to keep them biologically alive is as harb, is as severe, the uptaking them guft as killing his body. And then the Rebbe says noch erger, even worse. Vaila, and he brings a sefer, kasha misa ruchnis yesem emicha gashmi. Spiritual death is worse than physical death. So he wasn't killing the boys, he was killing all the children, but in two different methods. The boys were being killed physically, and the girls were being killed spiritually. And the Rebbe says, the dermon de gezeira, this aforementioned decree, for v'chalabasta chayr, keeping the girls alive in the spirit of Egypt, to that seeing Yiddish kinder, to rear Jewish children in them leben koch von Egypt, with the passion of life of Egypt, is eich merumas, is even hinted in them kalabein hayil the eda tashachol. When the boys were thrown into the river to die, they were thrown into the river because their physical death was also spiritual. How? And the Rebbe says what I told you before, that Taich Nilos is Gevedi Avedizaref Mitzrayim. The people in Egypt worship the river, the Nile, or as I like to say it, the Nile. Zu Vemen de Mitzrayim haben gedient, which the Egyptians worshipped. The Poshet Asib is given. Why do they worship the river the Nile? Val Nilos is given their kval for Parnasa. The river the Nile was their fountain of livelihood, and it never disappointed them. Every year there's the floods. You know the history of ancient Egypt. Do you know the history of ancient Egypt? There was a pharaoh, and the pharaoh had one job, to make the flood happen. Now how do you think the pharaoh made the flood happen? He did a bunch of yabba dabba doo, and he waited for the flood to happen naturally. That's what he did. And if there was a season, if it ever happened that the river Nile didn't flood, they would kill the king. It was very simple. Now the fact of the matter is the king wasn't doing anything. But that was the culture. That's what they worshipped. They worshipped their king, and their king was supposed to make the rivers flood. Now if you think about it, Yaakov Avinu gave the Pharaoh the blessing that the river Nile should rise up to him. So it makes sense that after Yaakov Avinu, the tradition would remain. There was one Pharaoh who actually could make the floods happen because Yaakov gave him that bracha. But when that Pharaoh died, it continued. That the Pharaoh's job is to make the river flow. And there's a summertime when it's a little trickle. And then there's a springtime or whatever it is at the end of the summer when the floods are incredible. And it floods the entire surrounding area. And it's one of the most fertile places in the entire planet is the valley in Egypt. And that was the king's job. So everybody was busy worshipping what? Nature, predictability. And in fact, it's God. So when you throw a boy into the river and drown him, you're killing him physically in the God of Egypt. So you're not only killing him physically, you're killing him spiritually also. You don't put him in your bathtub, you put him in the river. You're sacrificing him to what they worshipped as their source of livelihood. Okay? When you throw the boy into the river, there's 2 points here. Aleph, Golus Mitzrayim Begashmis, the physical Egypt, uptaken Rachman Lasadam Yiddish and Guf, to murder, God forbid, the Jewish body. And Beis, number 2, Golus Mitzrayim Beruchnius, the spiritual exile of Egypt. Arayim warfen Zeyen der Aveda Zore und Teinig von Mitzrayim, to throw them into the idol worship and the light of Egypt, which was spiritual. And the Rebbe says, uptaken Rachman Litzlan Zeyen Neshama, to murder, God forbid, their soul. Varum ye'er b'shteit von Wasser, was is in infantainig, and so on and so forth. So now you have a wonderful sicha from the Rebbe. The next page, which I don't have time to read, but the Rebbe talks about us in America. America is about career, and America is about success, and success is about wealth and fame and power. That's it. Nobody cares about your family life. Nobody cares about your children. Nobody cares about anything. As long as you make it. And it's an idol worship. It's a getchke. Because it's not at all real. What's the most important thing in the world? Family. That's the most important thing in the world. Not how much money I have. Not how times my name is in the paper. So the Rebbe uses this metaphor to make that argument. And he says, we live in America. And the American culture is based on the American dream. And the American dream requires us to live a certain way. These values are either going to kill us in the river denial of America, or they're going to keep us alive in the spirit of American living in the river denial of America. And they're both diseases. They're both Jewish diseases. They're both terrible for a Yid. A Yid is not allowed to lose himself in America, and a Yid is not allowed to assimilate in America. A Yid in America has to be a Yid like Europe, has to serve Hashem. You have to make a living. But you're not defined by your livelihood. You have to have a career, you have to have a job, but you're not defined by your career and your job. You're defined by your home and your family and by your relationship with HaKadosh Baruch. So the Rebbe uses this Sicha as a foundation, as a basis for this argument that we came to a new country, right? The Jewish people en masse came to America when, whatever time, after the Holocaust, let's say, but much before. And for too many generations and too many Jewish people, we came to America, we became American. We became American not only in the fact that America gave us freedom, we became an American that it was very important to be what an American is. The most important thing is my career. The most important thing is my job. The most important thing is to have more money and to have more things and to live the American dream. And the Rebbe says we drowned ourselves in the worship, in the idol worship of America. America is very nice to us, to our bodies, but not to our souls. It's a form of exile. America is a form of exile like Europe was a form of exile. Europe was an exile which was physically terrible. America is an exile which is spiritually terrible because it lures us in. And all it wants from us is to be like everybody else, right? The old adage of America was, right? What was the word they told you on Ellis Island when they finally let you through? It was a 4-letter word. 4-letter words are bad. Does anybody know? Melt. Become like everybody else. Melt. The melting pot, right? Later it became the great mosaic, but for a very, very long time, become an American. Now you're supposed to be an American, but you're supposed to be a Jew. And you have to hold on to your Jewish identity. And if you lose your Jewish identity in the melting pot of America, whether you live or you die, you're drowning in the river denial. Death is one form of death. Living as an American is another form of death. The boys were killed in one way, the girls were killed in a different way, but the Egyptian intent was the same, to assimilate the Jewish people. That there shouldn't be Jews, there shouldn't be a nation who look to heaven, who look to their Eibishter for their lives, but instead look to nature and to the world. And I will see you next week in Mitzvah Shem.